Section 20. Jesus Christ the Messiah. Jesus' cornerstone claim is in his identity as the Jewish Messiah, which he claimed would be verified by his death and resurrection. This section will be evaluating how he could have naturalistically come to this conclusion alongside his radical reinterpretation of Jewish scripture. To begin, it's essential to consider not only the historical and cultural context of first-century Roman Palestine, but also Jesus' personal spiritual journey and the specific circumstances that shaped his life and ministry. Jesus grew up in a Jewish society deeply influenced by messianic expectations. The belief that God would send a divine deliverer to free Israel from Roman oppression and establish a new era of peace and justice. These expectations were rooted in centuries of prophetic tradition and were particularly fervent during times of political turmoil and foreign domination. Jesus' personal conviction that he was to fulfill this messianic role might have stemmed from various sources, including his upbringing and early experiences. If his mother Mary believed him to be the Son of God, as the stories of his miraculous birth suggest she did, it's plausible that she communicated this to Jesus from a young age, profoundly shaping his self-understanding and sense of divine calling. This early influence could have laid the foundation for his later identification with the messianic role. However, this would not explain how Jesus came to believe he was the Messiah from being told he was the Son of God, as contemporary interpretations of Jewish scripture never connected the Son of God with the Messiah. For context, the term Son of God was occasionally used to refer to Israel as a whole, or to the King of Israel, who had a special relationship with God, like in Psalm 2:7, but never explicitly to the Messiah. However, in verses 2 to 3 of the same psalm, the Son of God is mentioned records. The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles." In Hebrew, the word for anointed is Mashiach, which is the same word for Messiah. In this context, Mashiach refers to someone who has been anointed with oil, a ritual symbolizing divine appointment or consecration for a special purpose. While this word is used to refer to various figures like kings or priests in the Old Testament, prophecies from prophets like Nathaniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel would eventually make the word become associated with the future anointed one, who would be the deliverer or redeemer of Israel, what came to be known as the Messiah. For Jesus to have made this connection at some point before his ministry implies he had a novel understanding of Jewish scripture. This novel understanding might have come from his desire to understand what being the Son of God meant, and delving into scripture to find out. A truly novel understanding was possible, considering he lived in the small town of Nazareth, far from the religious center of Jerusalem, giving him the opportunity to develop his own distinctive interpretation, separate from contemporary rabbinical beliefs. This interpretation might have become fairly sophisticated before Jesus was an adult, as the Gospel of Luke suggests that when Jesus was as young as 12, he was familiar enough with Jewish scripture to have a meaningful discussion with elders at the temple in Jerusalem. Beyond developing his understanding of Jewish scripture, we can guess that before the public ministry of Jesus at age 33, he may have been secretly preparing himself for the challenges of proclaiming the radically countercultural message he was developing. The Gospel accounts portray him as a figure of remarkable compassion, wisdom, and charisma, capable of winning the devotion of his disciples, a personality he may have had time to refine until his missionary work began. We can also observe that Jesus' teachings and practices may have been heavily inspired by the Essene community, with which his cousin John the Baptist was associated. Like the Essenes, Jesus emphasized spiritual purity, communal living, and devotion to sacred texts. He also may have embraced Essene principles such as charity, forgiveness, non-violence, and gathering a close-knit community of disciples who shared his way of life. The similarities between these aspects of the Essenes and Christ's actual ministry is significant, however not total. Christ diverged from their strict asceticism and legalism, instead emphasizing love, public ministry, compassion, and inner transformation. In the latter part of his ministry, Jesus began to speak more openly about his belief in his impending death and resurrection, how he came to believe that he should not only let himself be killed, but also that he will resurrect, can possibly be explained by his unique interpretation of Jewish scripture, the heavy messianic expectations of the time, and his belief that he is the Son of God. Jesus might have believed he was supposed to fulfill the suffering servant predictions made by the prophet Isaiah, part of which reads, "Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, and though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors." If we assume Jesus saw himself as the righteous servant in this passage, he may have personally come to understand the light of life as implying he will resurrect after he is killed. In fact, he explicitly demonstrates his belief that he will resurrect in the Gospel of Matthew 12:38-40 by saying, "Then some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, 'Teacher, we want to see a sign from you.' Jesus answered, 'A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth.'" Interestingly, the suffering servant passages does not suggest the servant will resurrect in 3 days, nor does the light of life unambiguously suggest a resurrection, but Jesus implies both alongside his reference to the story of Jonah. Neither prophecy explicitly suggests that he would need to die, only that he would need to suffer. His belief that he would need to be killed could be rooted in the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac, only for God to provide a sacrificial substituting ram at the last moment when Abraham resolves to do it, sparing Isaac. For Abraham's faith and radical trust, God forms a covenant with him and all his descendants, which would be the basis of Jewish faith. Understanding himself as the Son of God, Christ might have seen his role as an inversion of the story, where God demonstrates his commitment to humanity by sacrificing his only son, but this time without a replacement, and to make a new covenant with humanity. This connection between the suffering servant passage of Isaiah 52:53, the story of Jonah, the original formation of the Abrahamic covenant, and his own fate suggests that Jesus had developed a deeply personal, novel, and interconnected understanding of Scripture that would ultimately culminate in his conviction that he would have to let himself be martyred and be resurrected in 3 days. However, this was not the only demonstration of his knowledge of Jewish scripture and prophecy. Christian scholars point out how he plausibly fulfilled over 300 Jewish prophecies over his life. Of course, most of the prophecies could have been intentionally fulfilled by Jesus if he had a solid knowledge of Jewish scripture because they involve a figure performing specific deeds. But some were out of his control, like being born in a certain genealogy. Even if one does not accept Jesus' theological identity, his life and teachings undoubtedly reflect a profound love for God and humanity. His willingness to endure extreme suffering and humiliation for the sake of others continues to inspire and challenge those who encounter his story. At the heart of his message is a radical compassion that embraces the marginalized, challenges religious hypocrisy, and calls for a transformation of the heart. Nearing his death, the depth of Jesus' love and compassion is perhaps most poignantly expressed in his words from the cross. Even as he endured the agony and humiliation of crucifixion by people who knew he was innocent and was abandoned by all his friends, he cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." In this moment of supreme suffering, Jesus exemplified the radical forgiveness and unconditional love that he taught. He saw beyond the hatred and ignorance of those who persecuted him, offering them mercy and understanding even as they took his life. While the question of Jesus' ultimate nature remains a matter of faith, exploring his story with empathy and care can provide valuable insight into the power of his example. Regardless of one's beliefs, his life invites us to consider the depth of our own commitment to love, mercy, and faith in the face of adversity.